February 9th, 2022 was a historic day for Mario Kart 8 Deluxe fans around the world. Nintendo officially announced that over the next 2 years, we would be receiving 6 batches of 8 tracks, each remastered from games across the entire Mario Kart franchise, giving us an entire game's worth of content for half the price of the base game. It's been more than 2 years since then, and now that the Booster Course Pass content has been fully released, I wanted to do an in-depth analysis of everything we got, the good, the bad, and the downright ugly. Since the main draw of the Booster Course Pass for the vast majority of people is the new tracks, let's start by talking about those. Let's get this out of the way first. The graphical quality and art style of the Booster Course Pass is... It's not so much that the art style itself is bad, although there are some pretty obvious examples where that is the case. The issue for me is consistency. Mario Kart 8 Deluxe tends to go for a much more detailed and realistic graphic style that really showcases what the Nintendo Switch is capable of. Just looking at Ice Ice Outpost for one example, the textures on the glaciers are complex with multiple shades of whites and blues to closely mimic what you might actually see if you were to go into the Arctic. The Booster Course Pass, in contrast, is filled with example after example after example of these flat textures with little to no detail, which again, doesn't necessarily make them bad, but it does make them seem like they're not really part of the same game. And if all the tracks were like this, that would be one thing, but then you have courses like Riverside Park or Bowser's Castle 3 where there clearly was a lot of time putting into making them look amazing. And so again, the issue isn't the quality of the art itself, it's just the consistency of the style between the base game and the Booster Course Pass. But look, I don't want to be just another YouTuber who dumps on the graphics because, as I've said time and time again, graphics really don't matter to me all that much so long as the tracks themselves are fun to play. Hot take incoming here, but honestly, if I had to pick, I think the 48 Booster Course Pass tracks are probably better than the base 48 tracks on average. One thing that I think is often overlooked with the base game tracks, and especially the Nitro courses, is that while a lot of them look incredible, this often comes at the expense of the layout of the tracks themselves. Even in Cloud Top Cruise, which has to be at least in the conversation for most badass track in the game, you spend about a third of each lap in the Thundercloud section, which again looks fantastic, but you're literally just driving straight for about 10 seconds and maybe hitting a boost pad or two if you're on a good cycle. Fortunately, this was largely addressed by the time the first 2 DLC packs for Mario Kart 8 on the Wii U came out, both of which feature some awesome track designs that represent a major step up in quality over what came before. And that attention to fun and innovative track design is clearly present in the Booster Course Pass. Yeah, we got some real stinkers like Choco Mountain, Calamari Desert, and Sky High Sundae, which is almost universally reviled as being one of the worst tracks in the game, but on the other hand, it features some of my personal favorites like DK Summit. Seriously though, there are some amazing examples of creative track layouts and obstacles in many of the Booster Course Pass tracks. For one of my personal favorites, let's take a look at Yoshi's Island from Wave 3. Perhaps the most unique object in the entire game is the floating question mark box that shows up towards the end of the lap. It goes back and forth in an extended figure 8 pattern, and hitting it opens up a shortcut that saves a monumental amount of time, even compared to shrooming through the off-road. You might be surprised to hear me call this my favorite example of cool track design given how much of a whiny asshole I was being on Twitter when this thing first came out. To be clear, I still do think that designing it in such a way that it can be literally impossible to hit was certainly an interesting choice to say the least. But all I'm trying to say is that this is one example where you can really tell that the developers were trying to have fun and really be creative when designing the new tracks, and not simply make every shortcut a patch of dirt for you to mushroom through. Really, with the exceptions of Sky High Sundae and I guess Merry Mountain, pretty much all of the brand new courses have at least one really cool design choice. Ninja Hideaway has the moving platforms that, on a good pace, lead you to a metric boatload of coins and a double item set. Squeaky Clean Sprint has the toilet fountain that leads to a faster path, and that path once again splits off if you need to grab more coins and items. Piranha Plant Cove is the only course in the game that explicitly makes use of underwater physics to enable shroomless shortcuts. But if you thought that these were the only examples of creativity in the Booster Course Pass, you would be sorely mistaken. Let's talk about the city tracks. The Booster Course Pass features 14 tracks that were inspired by major cities around the world from Mario Kart Tour. In Mario Kart Tour, each city track has multiple layouts, and the way that this is handled is by including the entire city in each version, but then blocking off different parts of the track. In Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, these different variations of the track are combined into one big sectional track, or in the case of Paris Promenade, a traditional lap-based track where most of lap 3 is driven backwards. I'm probably going to get roasted for this, but I think that the city tracks are what really elevate the Booster Course Pass and bring it above the base game tracks. I know, once again, I made a whole video about why I wasn't hyped for Wave 4, and I specifically cited the city tracks as one of the main reasons for that, but let me defend myself a little bit here. By the time that Wave 4 had dropped, the only really good city track that we had at the time was Sydney Sprint, or if you're a weirdo like me, London Loop. The earlier Booster Course Pass tracks tended to have very simple layouts with little to nothing in the way of advanced strategies or shortcuts. Each lap of Paris Promenade, for example, features just a handful of pretty easy turns, a glider ramp, and a single trick ramp on lap 3 that you really can't do anything interesting with. Wave 4 gave us Amsterdam and Singapore, which were both okay, but then the final two waves came out and gave us Athens Dash, Vancouver Velocity, Rome Avanti, and Madrid Drive, all of which are among my favorite courses in the game. And the reason for that comes down to the complexity of the tracks. When you're running a 3-lap track, mastering the course really comes down to mastering a single lap, since you're mostly doing just a rinse and repeat on laps 2 and 3. But for the city tracks, you've got to put in 3 times the effort, which means that the difference between the people who have really learned the track and those who haven't is generally going to be much more apparent online. Let's just take a look at Vancouver Velocity for a minute. The strats on the left are for my current personal best, while the strats on the right are from what I would usually call a level 1 or easy version of the run. You can see that from just the first 20 or so seconds of the run, we're already inching ahead, saving more than a full second over the simpler strategies. This makes the city tracks from Wave 4 on much more rewarding to learn, and this is honestly also true for the Waves 4 through 6 retro tracks. In Waves 1 to 3, I could probably count on one hand the number of non-city courses that I actively enjoyed playing online, namely Mario Circuit 3, Maple Treeway, and Peach Gardens. Yes, I left out 3DS Rainbow Road off that list. I'll have more to say about that in my track ranking. The other tracks aren't necessarily bad, they're just not particularly interesting to me, or in some cases, they're straight up broken. But Wave 4 has Riverside Park and Waluigi Stadium, Wave 5 has Daisy Cruiser and Koopa Cape, and Wave 6 has DK Mountain, Rosalina's Ice World, Daisy Circuit, and Bowser's Castle 3, all of which are really fun and massively reward the player for taking even just 1 hour to mess around in time trials and learn the strategies. On DK Mountain in particular, the difference between just a straightforward run through the track and the run that you can check out in basic training is about 8 seconds, and that's even assuming that you learned how to do the gap jump. So yeah, even though the Booster Course Pass got off to a kind of rocky and slow start in the beginning, at least in my opinion, the fact that the tracks in the back half were so good more than makes up for that. The Booster Course Pass didn't just add new content though. It also made some pretty fundamental changes to how the game is played, which have had a huge impact to the time trial and competitive scenes. You see, Nintendo apparently pays a lot of attention to Reddit, and pre-patch Reddit hated the old Waluigi Wiggler meta, despite the fact that, like I've shown time and time again, you do not need to be a tryhard to win online. But that's neither here nor there, because regardless, when Wave 3 dropped, Nintendo added a hidden statistic that controlled how long your cart stays invincible after getting hit by items. And they gave Waluigi, Wiggler, Rollers, and Paper Glider absolute trash invincibility. The idea, I think, was to rebalance the online meta away from Waluigi Wiggler while still keeping time trials intact. But let's be real, the invincibility changes were never going to have any lasting effects on the game, because in the situations where invincibility could have an impact, namely when people are specifically targeting you, it's not the least bit difficult to just play around the increased invincibility and delay your extra fireballs or red shells or whatever else it is you have. And there's basically no circumstances where you would ever want to sacrifice your ability to drive well for a little bit of extra invincibility frames. Most of us knew this as soon as the changes dropped, and so we all sat back and laughed at Nintendo's feeble attempts to destroy our purple god. The only way they could ever get rid of Waluigi Wiggler is by making him drive worse than the other combos, and because of how much this would impact the time trial scene, they'd never be crazy enough to Yep, it happened. In Wave 4, Nintendo gave more speed to every character lighter than Waluigi, and more mini-turbo to a bunch of other lighter characters. They also gave more mini-turbo to every cart except for Wiggler, Bitty Buggy, and the Pipe Frame class carts, and every tire except for Rollers, Azure Rollers, Buttons, and Leaf tires. When these changes dropped, I boldly predicted that we'd be in exactly the same state we're in now with regards to build diversity online, except with a new combo for all of the competitive players to use. That's because no matter how you slice it, while it may be true that the gap between the best and worst combos has decreased post-patch, there will always be a single combo that is just better than the others, and that's what people are going to want to use. I was honestly amazed that these changes went through because it really screwed up the entire time trial and speedrunning scene. Legendary records that stood for hundreds of days were beaten by objectively less precise runs that were carried by stat boosts, invalidating overnight the thousands of hours that people sunk into making the top times as optimally driven as possible. I personally know multiple speedrunners who had Mario Kart 8 Deluxe as their go-to game pretty much stopped playing as soon as Wave 4 dropped because they felt that there was no way to tell whether their runs were actually improving or not, and they didn't want to waste the time until Nintendo was done messing with the stats. And it didn't stop there. In Wave 5, they rebalanced the game again. This particular set of changes was primarily centered around tweaking invincibility, but some really off-meta high-speed combos got boost to mini-turbo. Paradoxically enough, due to how the game handles deceleration, this resulted in behavior where these high-speed combos would actually lose speed when coming out of a mini-turbo. There aren't a ton of tracks where these combos are used, but the ones that do were so optimized prior to Wave 5 that they became literally unbeatable and remain so to this day. The rebalancing didn't just stop with tweaking build stats though. The last thing that I want to talk about is the infamous bagging nerf, but before we get to do that, we need to make a quick digression to talk about what bagging even is and how the item system itself encourages it. How many times have you been in a situation where you're in a race, you're doing just fine, and then all of a sudden you find yourself in the mid-pack pulling nothing but mushrooms while everyone around you is getting stars, plants, flowers, you name it. This is one of the absolute worst places to be in, and so oftentimes the optimal competitive play is to purposely drop back to 9th place or below and camp an item set to pull power items like stars, lightnings, and bullet bills. Intentionally dropping back like this to pull powerful items is what's known as bagging, and the reason people do it is because of how Mario Kart 8's item system is set up. It's a really complicated topic, but for the Cliff's Notes version, the items you can pull depends both on what position you're in and how far you are away from first place. As it turns out, when you're in 6th through 8th, you can pull pretty much any item in the game, including things like single red shells, which, as you could imagine, aren't going to do anything to help you at all in making a comeback. However, as soon as you drop to 9th place, two things happen. First, most of the items are removed from the pool. Second, the distribution of the remaining items gets shifted much more heavily towards power items, which means that dropping back to 9th for even half a second dramatically increases your chances of pulling something that might actually help you win a race. And this is where the bagging nerf comes in. When Wave 6 dropped, it brought with it a change to how these more powerful items are distributed, namely that you can get a maximum of 2 power items per set. Once you've hit that threshold, or if you intentionally slow down too much to try and game the system, you will only get crap items until the next set. The main problem with this change, in my opinion, is, well, for one, it didn't really accomplish anything because the nerf itself was pretty minor. You have to slow down a lot before it finally kicks in. But for two, it completely misses the point of why bagging is a thing that exists in the first place, which is that if you're in the mid-pack, it's incredibly difficult to actually pull items that are going to help you out of a tight spot. Rather than punish people for hanging out in the back for too long, what they really should have considered was increasing the power level of the mid-pack items, either by doing away with the placement-based aspect of the item system altogether, or else tweaking the individual distributions so that trying to claw your way out of 6th place doesn't feel like such a hopeless endeavor. Suffice it to say that of all the things they could have patched to make the game more fun and competitive, this was probably one of the sillier things to go after. Anyways, that's all I've got to say about the Booster Course Pass. What do you all think? Let me know down in the comments below.